something that just came to mind regarding possibly why, in quotes, some people or a lot of people who have a history of trauma then end up with something like so-called bipolar. And one could say, well, it's partly because of unresolved trauma. And how do people often resolve trauma? Well, it's finding out who's to blame and then maybe going after them in some way to make somebody wrong, such as via the justice system. So it's about punishment, punishing somebody. And it's possible that a lot of people don't go that route for whatever reason. They don't have support, they don't want to, they're too afraid. It's not something that's punishable by law. It's a hard path to go. And maybe some people see the futility in that path. Or they feel it was partly their fault. So, sometimes people have these trauma backgrounds and they end up going into a so-called manic state. And a manic state is creative. And what I'm trying to say is there could be a blessing in disguise, in quotes, in that going after somebody to punish somebody doesn't really resolve anything. It makes somebody right and somebody wrong. But this division of right and wrong, and somebody's good and somebody's bad, is all conflict, and nothing in the world is going to be resolved by conflict. And I'm not saying that to say like there's no such thing as a crime or whatever. But there's some countries that rehabilitate people who have been convicted of crimes as opposed to just punishing them and allowing them to rot away. So what I'm saying is, I don't know if it's partly a mechanism that people with a big amount of unresolved trauma go into mania, which is a creative state. But what I'm saying is, intelligent brains in a creative state is what's going to resolve human problems on a whole. Like when Einstein said that today's problems can't be resolved by the same level of thinking that created them. So today's conflicts aren't going to be resolved by creating more conflicts. So it's not that an individual person sees that per se and then they go into a manic state to resolve something or create something, but that state, I feel, is completely out of the field of conflict. It's a creative state. There's no conflict. Everything feels effortless and magical. And more brains being in that state more of the time is what is going to lead to change in the world. But then I talked about earlier how a lot of times it's wasted creating more food for thought, which just creates more conflict and resistance. So if one creates food for thought, is going to amplify the field of thought. But can one create food for perception, for insight, for intelligence to open up in the brain? So for example, I've heard of how they've done studies where they give criminals MDMA or some kind of drug-assisted psychotherapy, like an ethogen, I think that's the word, something that opens up the feeling of oneness and connectivity, and then how that decreased recidivism or relapse of committing crimes once one is out of jail and free in society. Because when one realizes how one everything is, one doesn't want to harm anything because it's all one thing. And whatever one does to oneself too. because there is no separate self. There is no separate actor. And that could be part of what needs to be learned when one goes into a so-called manic state. One might still feel like, I'm separate from this bad world and I'm going to do something about it. And then when one fuels that perspective with that energy, it can lead to feeling grandiose because one is so great and has all this energy and would never do anything like that. But then when the state falls apart, one goes into lower states of consciousness like anger, blame, shame, guilt, and one sees, might see past lives of what one has done or what one has contributed to in this life, and it's a reality check like, no, you're not separate from all this, you're the same as all of this. The lowest to the highest. So I think part of it then would be to see that when one steps out of that field of action and reaction, one is the whole thing. So one moves as the whole thing, not as something separate acting on something else. It's a subtle distinction. So I think that's part of the point, is not separating oneself. But then I feel like part of what I've had trouble with is when one feels like one is the whole thing and one goes back into it, one feels like then the way one is ping-pong balled around is acceptable. It's like, I'm everything, so everything's okay. And I think that's what I've come to see, is that certain fields of conditioning are so strong that one does need to get away from that, at least temporarily. Because if one is in a field of conditioning and one has energy, it's going to fuel that automatically. And one could think, well, this energy could change things. And it does sometimes rapidly change things. Like I've experienced where all of a sudden people around me who are part of my conditioned past are acting in concert with what's going on in the energy field. But again, that conditioning doesn't like it. They want to go back, even though they're completely unaware of it. It can't last because it partly becomes uncomfortable to me because I see it so clearly, and others don't. Which would be like saying to a stranger, we are one consciousness. We're not separate. And one might say, oh, that's nice, that's a nice idea. But the felt sense of it that happens sometimes is much different than the idea of it. And I could say the idea of it to the people of my conditioned past. And when that state comes about again, I don't know. I'm not sure how it works, but I'm just seeing that getting away would be good. And the sad part of that is most people who go into these states, they get captured and they don't get a chance to get away. And there's a getaway of like being afraid and running for one's life, and there's a getaway that involves seeing things really clearly and consciously moving away, saying, this isn't for me right now. And now most people get captured by the mental health system, and they can't just say, well, I don't want this mental health system, this isn't for me right now. It's forced. And that's why we really have to take really, really good care of ourselves. But unfortunately, most of us live in poverty, and it's very hard to. So most of us are so trapped, and I really empathize with that. You know, that energy that we come in contact with that could really be creative is captured and translated into a system of thought. Is translated into a system, the mental health system, the system of psychiatry, all the people trained to tell people what their experience means. It means you have a mental illness. Now, if I was in that position and I were to say, there is no me, there is no you, it's one field of consciousness, we're not separate. And you don't realize that what you're doing to me right now, you're doing to yourself. And that's the thing that I learned recently was, and it's about the billiard ball effect, is that being around people that are conditioned, they will react. And I have fallen into reacting, thinking that that was going with being one with whatever. And then that brings up another metaphor of something that actually does happen to people in terms of speaking with those who are part of one's conditioned past, is that one gets flat affect and one literally cannot speak. There's no communication. One is related, as in relatives of those of the conditioned past, but there's no relationship, meaning that energy that one connected with is of a totally different quality than that of the level of conditioned thought. So when one that goes into that energy gets captured by the system of conditioned thought, one literally can't even speak because it's not a language that one speaks anymore. And the conditioning and the, so-called recovery movement is about being able to learn that language of being a separate self, which is an illusion, which is why when the brain breaks down from that, it's really hard to get that back. And then one is lost in fear and so many different scary emotions and anxiety and things, but one is feeling the separation of everyone else. One becomes like a garburator for all of that shit. Because one is in that field, yet one is one, and one is one with that field, which is based on anger, competition, using other people for our egoic purposes, and we can feel all that, and it's hell. So we feel the hell of it, and other people feel like this is how life is. So I could go back into that field and keep talking and keep trying to prove myself within that field, prove that I'm normal or whatever, and eventually not even be able to speak. Or I can see clearly and make the conscious choice now to not speak to them. They don't get it, and it's okay. That would be like trying to convince a psychiatrist that I'm not mentally ill. It's not going to happen. Why would I waste my breath? Interestingly enough, I had 8 minutes of calm breathing and 2 minutes of focused breathing while talking to myself in self-dialogue in the last 45 minutes or so. So that's cool that I breathe calm when in dialogue with myself, because I'm not having as much calm breathing lately in general. So it's good to know. That's why I like this spire thing. I can see more related to the relationship between experiencing trauma, like a traumatic event, and the manifestation of something like bipolar. And it's something about, at least this aspect is something about how if the body realizes that it's in a life or death situation, fight or flight, the brain has to go into this super fast processing speed of being able to take in all factors in order to get oneself out of that situation, which could be life-threatening. And what that does is it causes a transient hypofrontality, which is a term I learned from Jamie Wheel and Stephen Kotler. But basically, all concepts disappear because one can't think about what one's going to do in a linear fashion, like if I do this, then this will happen, then this, and prediction. The brain goes into a hyper-perceptive state, fight or flight, life or death, in order to get one out of there. And I would say it goes into fight or flight or light. What I mean by light is the brain goes into like a light speed quantum processing state where it can see all possibilities at the same time without even knowing that it sees all of them. And it knows the right possibility to get one out of there. And it knows what to do, and it can adapt. If something changes, it can adapt and quickly calculate. Super fast speed. It's the intelligence of the organism to save the organism without reference to the abstraction of the self. And so one goes into fight or flight or light. The light speed of the brain gets one out of there. And then later the self realizes what happened, and it goes into trauma, like somebody did something to me, and like the victim mentality. And I'm not going to talk about the validity of that or not. It happens. There's no way to avoid that, I don't think. But the light got one out of there. The lightning speed, fast intelligence of the brain, which is based on perception, clear perception of all the factors and action. And in that state, the brain realizes that's what it needs to do to get one out of there. And now, the thing is, the brain may not have ever accessed that state before, truly. It is said that we are constantly in a low level fight or flight. I think parasympathetic activation, cortisol, low level. But it's just, we brush it off, and it doesn't make our brain go into clear perception to change. The cortisol and that reaction kind of comes in, so we don't change anything, so we keep going with that. But the fight or flight or light gets us from the situation we're in, where we're stuck maybe, to out of there at some point. So since the brain now accesses that state of light, super fast processing, it has now unlocked the potential of that to happen at another time. And the thing is too, that related to that, what can happen is that since one along one's life generally isn't being themselves, like being their true being, they're generally being their conditioned version of themselves, of who they think they should be and who they're told to be, which is usually quite far off from what one is meant to be. So then what one sees is that trajectory of participating in being the conditioned version of oneself got one into that situation. It led up to that situation. So now the brain becomes hypersensitive to going back to function within that conditioning and go back to be the conditioned self. So then a lot of the pain and sadness and depression and anger and kicking and screaming it's not only the sadness of the events, but it's resistance to going back into that field, which is a field of people, using each other, which one becomes very sensitive to being used. So one sometimes becomes non-functional because functioning in society necessitates or necessarily means that one is being used by employment, by family, by so many different things. One is being used. And how being used and allowing oneself to be used over time can lead to a situation where one gets a major trauma. And the minor trauma would be the cortisol, parasympathetic, fight or flight realization that one is being used by systems of thought and buying into them by believing things. So it's another way that the apparently unfortunate situation of a major trauma can be a gateway into hyperspeed processing of the brain. And now since the brain has touched that, it has the possibility of touching that again. And it also becomes sensitive to the fight or flight of the conditioning. So the intelligence that was able to save the body in the trauma situation is still there operating and seeing it's intelligent to stay out of the conditioned society as it is. Hence non-functioning, which is seen as somebody's personal problem, but the brain just can't function in that field anymore. It's like, look what it leads to. It can see all possibilities of what it leads to. So if one is pushed back into that, the brain sees all possibilities of different traumas. And I've had that happen before, where like each way I turn, I see the ultimate possibility of moving in that direction. And they all lead to awfulness, to death. And of course, all possibilities ultimately lead to death. But the other possibility would be to die to the ego, which is that which feels the need to feed off the structures of society in terms of power, competition. The brain sees the falseness of all of that a lot of times. But I feel like people aren't seeing what's happening. So maybe a lot of people would be like, oh, I can't function, and feel bad about that. They don't see that they're actually doing a service to society by not being involved in that, especially if their brain can go into hyperspeed energy processing. That would only energize that. And then that's what happens, is people are back in the system in that they're systematized into trauma therapy, or not necessarily, mostly just drugging a person, poisoning their brain, because they suffered a trauma as a result of the poisonous structure of society. And then that super speed light processing of the brain then magnetizes all these different resources of society to say, oh, you're non-functional, we're going to help you. When really, if that person who became supposedly non-functional was able to stabilize in the light hyperspeed processing of the brain, the intelligence of that would stay outside of the conditioned structure and flower into that, one would magnetize people who would want to do the same, as opposed to like all these helpers trying to help someone who was traumatized or, labeled with a mental illness or something. Society creates mental illnesses. Society is a mental illness. So it's intelligent to step outside of that and not to function within that. There is another function. I don't know what it is. And one could think of functions in terms of mathematics. One could think there's a function of integration. When one steps outside of the structures of society that's based on all those competition, which requires tearing one person down so that another person gains. When one steps outside of that and that energy blossoms, it creates a ripple that might affect the consciousness of the society. But if one takes that energy into society, it magnetizes society's structures to help that individual when one realizes society can't be helped. It can't be helped, it can't be fixed. And they can't help but try to impose their help. Which is to help people function as a cog in the machine. One of the benefits of trauma is seeing all that society structure that just leads to trauma is meaningless. There's a woodpecker, I think, tapping on a metal sign. There must be bugs on it. One can either be playing video games with machine guns inside or outside, listening to a woodpecker peck on metal. One is beauty, one is violence. The delight and joy and beauty, or the pleasure and juice of violence. Take your pick. One destroys your brain cells. The other is yet to be seen. Oh, blow some love whistle towards him. Hey, we're making music together. Oh. You flew and then ate a bug in the air. Bunny rabbit.